Okay, thanks, everybody.
Heard a bit of a spirited Pentagon briefing. That was Rear Admiral John Kirby, grilled on a number of fronts. They talked Iraq, surveillance. We're now flying over Syria, Libya, the UAE's airstrikes. And just a few minutes ago, State Department spokeswoman Jen Psaki seemed to indicate that the ISIS threat she believes now has increased.
They, of course, have threatened to attack the homeland. We take those threats very seriously. And I think what you're seeing here is a response to our growing concern about the counterterrorism threats.
That sounds very different from things we've heard from the administration over the last few days. Let's bring in Pete Hegseth, CEO of Concerned Vets for America and Fox News contributor. All right, Pete, there's been a lot of back and forth. We heard from the Joint Chair Chief General Dempsey saying a few days ago, until we're convinced that there is a direct threat to the U.S. homeland, we're not going to go after airstrikes in Syria. Then we have this language from Jen Psaki today that seems to say we do think there are direct threats to the U.S. homeland. I don't know what to do with that.
Well, there's a lot of misinformation going on right now. Admiral Kirby, at the end of his briefing, effectively said the same thing. We know there's jihadists going there, getting radicalized, getting training, and likely attempting to come back home. So there's no doubt that the potential for that threat exists. What this administration and the State Department and Defense Department are walking a fine line between fully acknowledging it, which I think would require them to more overtly take very dramatic steps, not just in Iraq, but in Syria. And it was also very interesting, a couple of things, to hear him talk about the intelligence, how they mentioned there's a gap in intelligence in what they know. You can only hit targets when you know what you're hitting. We've had limited interaction with Iraqi forces, and we also have had very little surveillance in Syria that appears to be changing. They also acknowledge the fact that that border between Iraq and Syria today really isn't a border. Assad doesn't control a lot of that terrain, isn't attempting to take it back at this point. He's on the defensive. ISIS slowly goes between the two. So for us to seek permission in Iraq, who are we seeking permission from in Syria? If they see no border, we can't afford to either with this kind of a threat.
Yeah, and Admiral Kirby there seemed to try to walk that very fine line that you talked about with regard to, are we working with Assad? Are we coordinating anything with Assad? He said very quickly, we're not doing any coordination with Assad with regard to what we're doing in Iraq. And then there was sort of a little stumbling there because we know that we're flying intelligence, we're flying drones over Syria. He wouldn't say whether or not that's being coordinated. Of course, Syria now saying if you plan to do any strikes here, even on the bad guys, you have to come to us for permission. But Kirby seemed to want to make it clear that we're not cozying up to Assad. It's very complicated.
Absolutely. He is absolutely right. We're not going to ask Assad for permission. It's a government we don't recognize as legitimate. We've been calling for him to go for a long time. So he's walking, but at the same time, the distinction we're making is arbitrary. We request permission from the Iraqi government, or they request us, so we do it. Well, who do we request from? How do we request? We can't. So the comparison falls apart there. Clearly, we have interest, but I respect the fact that they don't want to acknowledge the fact that we're striking in Syria or flying surveillance over Syria. That's a classified operation. We don't want to tell ISIS what we're doing when we're doing it. It was leaked by someone within the administration, so I respect their desire to hold off on providing details of how robustly we're surveilling. We shouldn't tell the enemy what we're doing. We should just take the fight to them. And I hope this opens an opportunity to really, because this is an enemy, as vicious as it is, that can't just be contained, can't just be deterred. It's got to be defeated. It's got to be crushed. Hopefully these are steps toward doing just that.
And our own Pentagon correspondent Jennifer Griffin really pushed on some of these ideas about what we're doing in Syria, what we aren't doing in Syria, what we can and can't talk about doing. And Kirby, in responding to her, said that he's not going to look to geographic boundaries as a limit on protecting Americans and their interests, sounding like, just like ISIS isn't recognizing these borders, the U.S. may not either if we can somehow justify or show there's direct connection to our own interests.
Oh, we can't afford to. We live in too interconnected of a world, whether it's the Iraqi-Syrian border or, frankly, I think we've learned from the mistake in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Obviously, very different geopolitical strategic considerations. But part of our difficulty in Afghanistan for so long is the enemy was running across what was a very porous border where we couldn't touch them, or did in limited sense with drones. So if we learn that lesson in Iraq and Syria, we're going to apply similar pressure in Syria, because that is really the heart of ISIS. where they train, their headquarters elements. A lot of it is really in northern Syria. They've projected more recently into Iraq as they've tried to expand their orbit. And frankly, they don't want to be confined just to Iraq and Syria. They want to go to Lebanon. They want to go to Jordan. They want to go to Kuwait. They want to expand much further if they can. They've said just that. And of course, Shannon, they also want to strike the U.S. homeland in Western Europe, and they've got passport holders to do it, which is why this administration is slowly coming to the realization that they can't sit on the sidelines. We can't lead from behind. This is an enemy that has to be confronted. Our military leaders get it. We'll see how long it takes for the president and the White House to fundamentally understand that.
Better to acknowledge it before an attack than after. Pete, thank you so much. Always good to see you.
Thank you.